that I was doing pastoral ministry and also as well doing a family counseling practice as well, I discovered that people always tell me I want a different life. And my advice at that time and my advice today is if you want a different life, you have to decide to have a different life. You see, each and every one of us are only one decision away from a better and different life. The real reality of the situation is we can find ourselves falling into a rut. So, what is a rut? Well, a rut is actually a grave with two ends kicked out. That means that you are heading into a position where, basically you're not getting anywhere. I remember one time when I was out in the wilderness and I was driving along this road in my truck and I got stuck in a mud area and I couldn't go anywhere. And basically, I just was spinning my wheels. Sometimes that's how life feels. It feels like you are actually spinning your wheels. But you see, each and every one of us are only a one decision away from a different life. But the problem is, many of us are afraid to make that decision. You see, fear is, of course, the greatest adversary for change and a better life. Jesus said this, I have come to give you life, and I've come to give it to you abundantly. And many of us, we want a different life. We want, to have something that is significance. Now, remember, there are three things that people want in their lives. They want, number one, security. Number two, they want significance. And number three, they want, of course, self-esteem. And these three motivations are very powerful and very strong in our lives. But you see, you've got to make a decision to change. If you want to change, and if you want change, and that's also part of the problem, people don't necessarily like change. I know that there are people out there that are risk takers, and so they are not afraid of taking a risk. But the problem is, most people aren't, of course, willing to take a risk. There's a certain inbred fear in us when it comes to change. There was a movie written, actually, a particular book called Emma. It was, of course, written by Jane Austen. And in that particular book, Jane Austen was the actual protagonist, whose name was Emma. Her dad was afraid of change. He hated change. He wanted consistency, even if that consistency was boring. And many people, they prefer the boring instead of the exciting life. But you and I, if we want a different life, we have to make the decision to change. We have to make the decision to move forward. We have to make the decision to let go of certain things. We have to make a decision to move from where we are to move to where we want to be. For example, let's say you want to have more money. Well, it may mean that you have to leave the job that you are and risk take. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There was a guy who had a natural ability to be able to cook chicken. He had tried so many different, businesses and different things, and he had failed with every single one of them. But he could make chicken. And of course, he did it with 11 different herbs and spices. I think you know who I'm talking about. The guy's name was Harlan Saunders. Harlan Saunders took his last pension check and decided to invest it in a little business which he called Kentucky Fried Chicken. And guess what? He finally succeeded. But how did it start? One day he was sitting in his home and he said, I'm not getting anywhere. But the one thing I can do is I can make chicken. So you know what he did? He took a risk. He took a decision to change. Did you know that the one of the greatest presidents in all the United States had failed in everything that he had tried as a business, as a lawyer, as everything else? So finally, he made a decision. He said, you know what? I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to run for president. That particular man was Abraham Lincoln. You see, when you make a decision to change, the biggest thing is follow through and understand that there is going to be some difficulty along the way. But if you never take a risk, you're never going to, of course, see something different. Years ago, a friend of mine whose name was Roger said, there's a beautiful lake up in the Rocky Mountains. It was, of course, in Waterton National Park, which is a jewel, an absolutely lovely place to be able to go and to see wonderful, wonderful scenery. And this particular lake was called Goat Lake. He said, now it's going to be a difficult climb. And I, of course, being young, said, let's go and do it, Rogers. Well, it was a difficult climb. It was 7.5 miles straight up in the Rocky Mountains. It would take us almost 4 hours. The path at that time was about 3 feet wide, and there were some vertical drops. There wasn't in those days, some sort of guardrail. It was, basically hiking in on the side of a mountain. And there was a couple of times where you have the mountain on one side and a sheer drop on the other side. And we walked up that mountain, up into that beautiful, wonderful little lake. It was completely surrounded by, of course, mountain, but there was a wonderful waterfall and the beautiful blue lake that was absolutely wonderful, and it was spring fed. I thought to myself, this is the most gorgeous place I've ever seen. And even today, it stands in my memory as one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. Roger and I made a decision that day that we were going to take a risk. We were going to walk up the side of a mountain, but the view and, of course, the beauty of the place overwhelmed and, was the very factor that made that difficult climb so rewarding. And I remember going down the side of the mountain thinking to myself, what in heaven's name are we doing here? But if you don't take a risk, you know what? You'll never understand the beauty of the journey. So we are only one decision away from a different life. But you got to make that decision. A lot of people don't make that decision and they stay where they are. I think about people who live in the same town year after year. I actually live in a small community. And when I was doing door to door to become a counselor in that town, or I was running to be on council, I met people who had never, ever lived in any other place than where they were living. And they had centered their entire life around that small community. And that's perfectly fine. But when I was growing up, I lived in a small community as well, but I didn't want to stay in that small community. So I knew that the risk that I was taking was leaving the familiarity and also as well the consistency of that small community. And there's nothing wrong if you don't want to leave your community. But if you want to make a life that is totally full of exciting, you have to leave where you are and go where you need to be. I knew that if I was going to be a radio broadcaster, I couldn't do it in the small town in which I lived. The reason why was simple. Well, we didn't have a radio station. So what did I have to do? I had to go to the city. Well, of course, before I came to where I currently live, for 13 and a half years, I was a radio broadcaster on the largest Christian radio station in all of Canada called AM 930 The Light. And for 13 and a half years, I had the privilege of broadcasting every single day, or I should say Monday through Friday, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. But I had to take a risk. Can I tell you the story of how I actually became a radio broadcaster in that station? One morning, I was sitting in my office and I was thinking about my career. I was a pastor at the time, but the Lord spoke to me and said, "You contact John Raymer of AM 930 Life." I was sitting in my office in the church that I was pastoring in St. Albert, and the Lord said, "Contact him." Now, I could have just ignored that particular little inner voice, but I made a decision right then and there that I was going to contact John Raymer. So I phoned AM 930 The Light. I got the secretary, who at the time was named, of course, Linda. And she got me in contact with John Raymer. And I said to John in that initial call, I said, "John, my name is so and so, and I happen to be a radio broadcaster of 30 years. I broadcasted across Canada in different locations. And if you need someone, to do some voice work, I'm here." John called me back the next day and said, "Would you like to come in? And I'd like to chat with you." So I went to AM 930 The Light, chatted with John Raymer, and John says, "I'm going to call you back tomorrow." So he called me back the next day and he said, "Would you like to come and meet Chuck Ellard, who was, of course, the owner of AM 930 The Light and Shine FM?" Well, what happened was I went in and met, of course, Chuck Allard, and Chuck was a dead ringer for my brother. And we were able to chat back and forth. We knew a lot of the same people. And he said, "You're going to be my new AM announcer." Well, of course, 2 weeks later, I was on the air and I was doing radio broadcasting from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. And I did that for 13 and a half years. The simple fact is, if I wouldn't have listened to that inner voice, if I hadn't made that decision, I would have been still doing something different. And the thing that I was doing was okay. But the Lord elevated me to a whole different position. I had a daily radio audience of over 400,000 people. Well, it also began a wonderful second ministry, of which I am doing right now. And of course, there are now thousands of people who listen to me on social media. It began a whole new perspective. I hadn't done social media that much until I became a radio broadcaster. And the radio broadcaster, of course, did Facebook and they did YouTube and a whole bunch of other things. And if you check out my earlier videos, then you will see that I'm sitting in a radio station and I am broadcasting daily on both, the social media and on of course, YouTube, and I'm doing a daily radio broadcast. You're only one decision away from a better life, an abundant life, but you gotta take the risk. You've got to be able to say, "You know what? I am going to change that, my life." And you never know where that change could actually bring. It could bring a life that you have always wanted. You see, when I was 13 years old, I got this brochure from the Columbia School of Broadcasting. Up to that point, I wanted to be a writer. Now, I still do writing and, other things as well, but I focused my life on being a radio broadcaster. Now, the Lord also took me into, of course, pastoring. But the beautiful thing is, the last 13 and a half years, I was able to fulfill my particular dream, and that I always wanted to be a morning man or a radio broadcaster on a major market studio or a major market station. And I got to do that. That was an actual answer to prayer and also as well a dream of mine. I got to have that dream. Well, so I'm just going to ask you a question. What is your dream? What is it that you want to do with your life? What is your interest? Then take the risk and actually do it. You see, I'll close with another story. There was a young man who was living in a place called Aurelio, Ontario. This young man had the ability to be able to sing and also as well play the guitar. And he was a bit of a songwriter as well. Now, his family looked at him and said, Gordon, you know what? You should, follow the family trade. His father was a certain, fella involved in the trades. And his dad was trying to push him towards the trades. He said, Dad, I don't want to do what it is that you're doing. What you're doing is perfectly fine for you, but I don't want to do that. I have a dream of being a songwriter, a musician, and a performer. That's my dream. And his dad looked at him and said, Gordon, follow your dream. Go after your dream. It's not going to be easy, but go after it. And so Gordon Lightfoot, who is, of course, one of Canada's premier songwriters, musicians, and also as well performers, he started off in small coffee houses in different places, throughout Canada. He went and was basically involved in the folk scene of Toronto. And also as well, got talking. He took some risks. He made some, demos, and he flogged those demos to all the different, songwriting and also as well record companies. Finally, someone took a risk on him. And he wrote some great songs like Sundown and The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and other songs as well that were used by other, other people who were performing. And he became Canada's foremost troubadour. And he took the risk. And that decision gave him a lifetime of wonderful memories. Not that long ago, of course, Gordon Lightfoot passed into eternity, but not before he had changed the music scene in Canada. There was another young lady, which was named Shania Twain. Shania Twain was known during the 90s as the Queen of Country. And so basically, she made a risk to take her talent and to, use it for, the benefit of others. And today, of course, she travels around the world and she sings, before thousands of audiences. One of her dreams was actually fulfilled in 2025 when she was 60 years old. She's 60 years old. She looks fantastic for 60. But you know what? One of her dreams was she wanted to be the parade marshal of the Calgary Stampede. She had the privilege of actually doing that this year. And it was really neat to see her not only as the parade marshal of the greatest show or the greatest outdoor show on the planet, but also as well perform at that particular show as well. It was her dream to do that. As a country and western star, she always wanted to perform at the Calgary Stampede. Well, she got to do it. And it was because she made a decision to follow her dream. So my simple fact is, you and I are only one decision away, but we've got to make that decision. We've got to take that risk. We've got to be able to say, you know what? If I want a different life, I am going to make that decision to do that. It's all about choices and decisions. So if you want a different life, make that decision. Yes, it's going to be a risk, but you know what? If you don't take the risk, you're going to stay in the rut where you are. So that's my advice for you today. My name is Robert Dean Steele. Thank you for joining me today, and have yourself a great and godly day. And make that decision today to have a better life. Because guess what? If you want a better life, if you want an abundant life, make the decision to head that direction. Have yourself a great and godly day.